for coming forward at law amendments, preferring to keep their head down as political parties work out their differences and make law. Companies like Michelin, companies like Sobeys, employers large and small who have unanimously come forward to say, this is a bad idea. This is a black mark against Nova Scotia. That's what Michelin said. This is a strike against Nova Scotia when we're considering looking at new investments. That's what Sobeys said on this particular bill. Madam Chair, that's not protecting the economy. That's actually hurting the economy. Not just the economy of today, where we have those very real employers that employ thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Nova Scotians, but as importantly, and as really not fully examined, the economy of tomorrow, the jobs of the future. There is no way to measure the damage, Madam Chair, in terms of lost opportunities to come, investments that won't be made, plants that Michelin might have to place somewhere in the world that won't come here, reinvestment in the current Michelin plants that are so important to our province that won't be made here. Sobeys has their head office and many corporate functions in Nova Scotia. There's no way to measure how many expansions and reinvestments and new investments they might make in this province that is their home, that they won't make because of this strike against the province that they now identify will be in place. We can only imagine how many jobs, opportunities in the future will be gone, will be lost, will go elsewhere because of this bill. And those are the bigger examples, Madam Chair, because at the end of the day, the Michelins, the Sobeys, the big companies, they can afford to send their corporate president or their lobbyist to Halifax to appear before committees of the House and make their case. And then we measure the impact, and in this case, the impact is very dramatic. But behind them, Madam Chair, are the thousands of small businesses, medium-sized businesses that don't hire lobbyists, that don't send a VP of government relations or a corporate CEO here to our committees to tell us what they think, that just keep their head down, they do their work, they retain a little bit of their company's earnings, they reinvest it back in their business, they look for that next opportunity. Who knows how we'll measure the lost opportunity in the thousands of jobs, of expansions, of businesses that won't get created, of new divisions that won't get formed. That's the real shame, Madam Chair, in this bill. This bill that says it's going to protect the economy is actually going to have dire consequences for the economy in ways that we could measure today, but in untold ways that we can't measure in the future. Madam Chair, at a time when the world economy, when the North American economy, when even the Canadian economy is on shaky ground and Nova Scotia is trying to hold its own in that volatile economic environment, to keep hold of the jobs we have, to keep hold of the opportunities that we have in our province today, bringing a bill like this forward, a black mark, a strike against, as others have said, doesn't protect the economy. It puts it at greater risk. And that's a horrible thing, Madam Chair. But on top of that, we have one good thing going for us in this province. We have an opportunity coming our way, which is the Irving Shipyard contract. We know that $30 billion worth of Canada's next generation of naval ships and supply ships are going to be built at the Irving Shipyard. We know by the latest estimates that a little over 3,000 jobs are going to be created directly as a result of that work. That's what's known. But Madam Chair, what's not guaranteed and what's not known is how much of that work Irving will do here in the province. They can't do it all on their own. Much of that $30 billion is going to be contracted out and subcontracted out to other companies. There is no guarantee that there will be Nova Scotia companies there to pick up that work. It can go anywhere in the country. And Irving, as a company, is responsible to make sure they find the best quality product at the best possible price. If we truly want to take that Irving contract and turn it into all that we know it can be, to create a modern, dynamic, sustainable, growing, long-lasting economy with real jobs that go beyond the contract, we need to get this right, not wrong. This bill puts us on the path of blowing the Irving Shipyard opportunity because it puts a big red flag up in front of all of those people who might want to take advantage of the work here in Nova Scotia that's going to be contracted and subcontracted. Imagine, for example, Madam Chair, that there's some young couple in Truro reading about the Irving work that want to start a business. Maybe they're going to supply nuts and bolts to the Irving shipyard because they know they're going to need to buy nuts and bolts by the millions to build those ships. And they're going to take their own savings and gather some money from family and friends, go to a bank, find an investor, start this business, hire some Nova Scotians, and bid on that work. Well, we need this to happen, Madam Chair. Not just that one example that I give to the House in committee today. We need that to happen hundreds of times over if we're going to turn that opportunity into a great opportunity, not just for Halifax, but for all Nova Scotia. Not just for the current generation of workers, but for all generations of workers. That's what we need to happen. But rather than put in place the conditions to allow that one example to turn into hundreds or 1,000 similar examples, the government has decided, on the heels of the announcement of the Irving Shipyard contract, to come in with Bill 102, first contract arbitration. They say to us, protect the economy. It actually is a big red flag, a big stop sign in front of that young couple in Truro that wants to start that business and supply the work, and the hundreds of others around them, a big stop sign that says, you can't afford to do that here. You can't take that risk, because the minute you start, you run the risk that your single biggest cost, your labor bill, won't be determined by you. It won't even be determined by the people that want to work for you. That you'll have to go and have a third-party arbitrator appointed by the government tell you what your costs are going to be. Now, unfortunately, Madam Chair, some of those people are going to say, no, I don't want to take that risk. Hopefully not all of them will, but what's impossible to measure is how many no's we're going to get. How many businesses are not going to get formed? How many jobs are not going to get created? And more importantly, Madam Chair, how many of those nuts and bolts and other supplies that could have been made and sold here in Nova Scotia, how many of those companies are going to be found elsewhere by the Irving Shipyard? How many of those jobs are going to go to New Brunswick, are going to go to Ontario, are going to go to somewhere else in the country or somewhere else in the world because this government, with this bill, put a big red stop sign in front of the Nova Scotians that are lining up to take advantage of the shipyard opportunity. That's the great problem with calling the bill an act to protect the economy. It does nothing but ruin our chances to turn what we have with that shipyard contract into something greater. And Madam Chair, for those that are still wondering if this could be true, I only point out that some of us in this chamber are old enough to remember the frigate contract that went to the shipyard in New Brunswick in the 1980s. They were given a large contract to build the next generation of frigates for the Canadian Navy, and they had an opportunity to turn it into something greater, or to let the opportunity lost, to let it come and go, to have the frigates built and commissioned and done and then go away, which unfortunately is what happened. In the St. John shipyard today, Madam Chair, is a fraction of what it could have been had they in New Brunswick had the foresight to put the conditions in place to allow that one contract to turn into something greater for all of New Brunswick. Now here we are right next door. We see what's happened in New Brunswick. We now have an even greater opportunity, and yet the government here is about to blow it in a similar way, to have the ships come and then to have them go out again. And that's a shame, Madam Speaker, or Madam Chair, and that's why the title of the bill, Unnecessary Labor Disruptions and Protect the Economy, is so laughable. So all of this, of course, leads to the question, Madam Chair, of why? Why do this? Why have an NDP government that was so determined to stand up and take credit for what's going on at the Irving Shipyard, but then in the same month as that incredible opportunity presents itself, be the same government to bring in Bill 102, first contract arbitration, which will do nothing but minimize the opportunity presented by the Irving Shipyard? Why do this? Why, in the face of overwhelming, unanimous disagreement among businesses, large and small, employers, large and small, and all of their associated organizations and boards of trade and chambers of commerce and business roundtables, why go ahead anyway? Well, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Chair, Madam Chair, it's pretty clear the government made up its mind a long time ago. This summer, they put out a discussion paper that if you blinked, you missed it on the government website. It was handed to some people favorable to the government in advance. A study day was called for a work day on short notice that only a few people could get to. One study day, people who could make an important contribution to that study day, like the member for Inverness, were kicked out and told there wasn't enough sandwiches at the lunch counter for them to stay. The person chosen to chair the study day was Rick Clark, a well-known friend of the government, the chair of the Premier's Economic Advisory Council, the president of the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour, someone who 10 years ago said it was his objective to bring in first contract arbitration in Nova Scotia. This was not a neutral examination of the pros and cons on this pathetic one-day study day. This was a sham designed to ram through what the government had decided it already wanted to do anyway. Even then, Madam Chair, Rick Clark, as co-chair of the Labour Management Review Committee, as head of that study day, was forced by the overwhelming evidence presented to him to report to the minister that his committee was unable to reach a consensus. Excuse me, Madam Chair, unable to reach a consensus. What did the government do at this written report of a lack of consensus? It bullied ahead anyway, within days, as a matter of fact, in the same session of the legislature with Bill 102, which brings us back to the question of why. If the government is not listening to its own Labour Management Review Committee, as much of a sham as it is, if the government is not listening to those that participated in the study day, as much of a sham as it was, if the government is not willing to listen to companies like Michelin and Sobeys, the largest private employers in the province, then who are they listening to? If they're not willing to listen to other employers, large and small, who we need to create real, meaningful, sustainable jobs, then why? Who are they listening to? That's why, Madam Chair, that at this late hour, after 3 weeks of debating this bill, with no movement on the part of the government to delay, slow down, take a second look at, think about twice, that's why we're now here at this point, where we have to conclude, sadly, that the government is listening to its own backroom friends and putting their interests ahead of the interests of the whole province. And Madam Chair, that's wrong. It is sad when we're here now at this late hour of debate on this bill, when we're left with the sad conclusion that the government is putting its own backroom partisan interests ahead of the interests of the province as a whole. I will point out, Madam Chair, that although MLAs organize themselves into political parties and have a duty, obviously, to their team, that nothing in that statement takes away from the fact that the primary duty of an elected MLA in this House is to their constituents. They are supposed to come first, and they have spoken loud and clear on this issue in my riding and in every member's ridings, and I know in the ridings that are held by NDP members. They have spoken loud and clear. There is no problem to solve. You are going way too fast. This is not the right time. This is the wrong bill. You're doing it for the wrong reasons. That's what presentation after presentation at Law Amendment said. That's what letter after letter written to the minister or to the committee has said. That is who our duty is first to. And when Nova Scotians in all parts of the province, whether they're in Cumberland County or any other county, are asked what their number one concern is, jobs comes up at or near the top of the list every time. Real jobs, sustaining jobs, future jobs, jobs for the next generation. And you know, Madam Chair, Nova Scotians are watching tonight. They may not have known exactly what first contract arbitration was all about a few weeks ago. But because we've been able to drag this debate out, to give Nova Scotians time to follow along, to give employers time to organize for Law Amendments Committee. They know now. They know that first contract arbitration at its heart is about jobs. It is about preserving the jobs we have, and it is about ensuring there are jobs there in the future. More jobs, not less jobs, more jobs. Particularly in places like rural Nova Scotia, where jobs are so hard to come by. So far from protecting the economy, Madam Chair, this bill does the exact opposite, and it's time for MLAs on all sides of the House to do the right thing, to consult with their constituents, to hear them loud and clearly say, jobs are the most important thing. This bill does nothing to protect jobs. It doesn't create any jobs. In fact, it puts jobs at risk. That's what we need to have happen here tonight, Madam Chair. And I say that knowing that no member of this House is an expert necessarily on every issue that comes before the House. We're not all experts on fiscal policy, monetary policy, job creation policy, health policy, education policy, and all of the other things that an MLA has to deal with. And because that's true, it makes it all the more important that when we are dealing with an issue as important as jobs, that we do listen to those who do have expertise and experience at creating jobs, at maintaining jobs, at making investments in jobs in our province, whether it's in Halifax or whether it's outside Halifax. But that's not what's happening here, Madam Chair, because those voices are there. They're speaking loudly and clearly, and we need to listen to them. I know that on this side of the House, we are listening. And that's why we are appealing to the government to set this bill aside, to at least set it aside and let a greater examination of the issue occur and not ram it through at this time. That's what we need right now, Madam Chair. Because on a bill like this, on an issue as important as jobs, the government should be bringing these things forward on the basis of evidence. And the onus should not be on employers to prove it won't be that bad, because that's the position the government is trying to put people in. Tell us why it won't be that bad. What kind of way is that to make legislation? Show us why it won't hurt that much. That's backwards, Madam Chair. The onus should be on the government to explain to all Nova Scotians, and certainly to their elected representatives in this House, what good is going to come from this bill. But that hasn't happened. They had an opportunity with the Labour Management Committee to examine the pros and cons. They cast that opportunity aside, even though they didn't even invite non-unionized employers to be on the committee. They cast that opportunity aside with this sham consultation and a study day where the only question was which form of first contract arbitration is better than which other form. And even then, that discussion didn't do any good, because we have the most aggressive, the most oppressive form of first contract arbitration before us today. This is why Nova Scotians don't want the bill. This bill, Madam Chair, because they are the real experts on creating jobs. Whether it's a self-employed Nova Scotian or that young couple in Truro that wants to employ 3 or 4 others, or whether it's among the largest private employers in the province, they are the experts on this topic. How to create jobs, how to finance jobs, how to invest in jobs. They are the experts. They're unanimous that this is a bad idea, and we should be listening to them. That's what should be happening right now, Madam Chair, but in fact, the government is doing the exact opposite. And quite frankly, that's a bad idea at any time, but it's a particularly bad idea at this time. So we've established it's the wrong bill, but it's also the wrong time, because the economy is on shaky ground. The government has a higher standard to set when it upsets the apple cart with new labor laws like this, because the effect of a bad decision by the government today is greater, because jobs are on shakier ground, Madam Chair. So if anything, the government should be setting this bill aside now, because it's a bad time to be upsetting the apple cart. One of the few things we do have going for us in Nova Scotia is this record of labour management peace, this record of harmoniously and freely negotiating collective agreements by the hundreds to a successful conclusion. Sobeys tells us, Michelin tells us, others tell us that is one of the factors they consider when determining whether to invest in our province and create jobs. That's true at all times, but it's particularly true when times are tough. So if the government needed a greater reason to set this bill aside than all the obvious reasons, that greater reason is now is a wrong time. Now is a terrible time to take this one advantage that we have accumulated over time in our province and kick the legs out from under it. But, Madam Chair, the government is not listening. The Minister of Labour, in her message in the Chronicle Herald, said that first contract arbitration will be very attractive, I quote, will be very attractive to people wanting to invest or expand their business in Nova Scotia. Well, where did the minister get that from? Who is the minister quoting when she speaks on behalf of those that do want to make investments in our province? Well, perhaps it is the Chief of Staff to the Premier. That is a pretty powerful person. But the fact of the matter is that the minister is putting words in the mouths of businesses in Nova Scotia by saying that they're going to find first contract arbitration to be very attractive. That was before the Law Amendments Committee was allowed to meet, Madam Chair. A mere days after the minister made that statement in the Chronicle Herald, we had a lineup of employers coming to law amendments that did what? They told the minister, they told this government the exact opposite. Far from finding it to be, quote, very attractive, as the minister tried to imply they would think, they could not have been more clear. Michelin, it's a black mark on Nova Scotia when we look for places to invest. Sobeys, it's a strike against Nova Scotia when we look for places to invest. Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Nova Scotia Chambers of Commerce, the Employers Roundtable representing 20 significant employers in the province, each and every one saying this is a bad idea, this will discourage investment in jobs, this will cost us future opportunities, unanimously so. And yet the very purpose of those presentations at law amendments, to inform the government about the effect of its decisions, is falling on deaf ears on the government side, Madam Chair, on an issue as important as jobs in many areas of the province. When Dana LeBlanc from Michelin was asked if he had told the Premier that this wouldn't affect Michelin, he said, and I quote, "That could not be farther from the truth." He told the Law Amendments Committee and the public of Nova Scotia very openly, this will have an effect on decisions that Michelin will make on reinvestment in those plants and jobs, or on future investments in our province and jobs. David Fearon from Sobeys said at Law Amendments, and I quote, "He is unaware of any business that wants to turn its economic future over to an outside third party to decide how it will operate." Well, that couldn't be more clear, Madam Chair. David Fearon, I'm sure, knows many businesses because not only is he a vice president with Sobeys, our single largest private employer, but he would know the hundreds, if not thousands, of Nova Scotia businesses that are suppliers to Sobeys. And he says, he is unaware of any business that wants to turn over its economic future to an outside third party. That's what law amendments is for the government to be informed about the ramifications of its decisions and to turn its back on Sobeys, on Michelin, on all the others that I just listed is wrong, Madam Chair. And it's Nova Scotians with their jobs that will pay the price unless the government sees fit to do the right thing, which we can only hope at this late stage, and shelve this bill. In their submission to the Labour Management Review Committee, Madam Chair, the Nova Scotia Chambers of Commerce explained that first contract arbitration does nothing to incent investment in this province, nor does it inspire job creation. And I have their submission here, and I'll table it for the benefit of the House. But just let me quote briefly from their submission. Madam Chair, because it was so clear. The round table, the Chambers of Commerce represent employers of over 34,000 Nova Scotians. And they stated that fundamentally, every employer needs to be in the position of determining wages, benefits, and working conditions, and ultimately have the right to say no if in good faith it considers that doing otherwise would adversely impact its business. They went on to say that the existing provisions of the Trade Union Act already provide significant protection for any improper bargaining tactics by either employers or unions, and that Nova Scotia has had and continues to have a good labour relations record, particularly in the private sector. And there is quite simply no need for any interference with collective bargaining through first contract arbitration. It is our opinion, they say, that the imposition of a first contract will only create a wedge between the union and the company at a time when relationship building is so important. Madam Chair, this is the voice of many, many, many employers, and I'll table that for the benefit of the committee. Madam Chair, Michelin told us that this will limit any future development the company might make in our province. Sobeys, which employs 10,000 Nova Scotians, in their submission, which I have here, and I will table in a moment, says, and I quote, "One of the things that we are most proud of is the fact that Sobeys is a Nova Scotia company. Approximately 10,000 people are employed in Nova Scotia. Sobeys, interestingly enough, employs both unionized and non-unionized employees, Madam Chair, in our province. And they say, one of the biggest attractions for Sobeys conducting business and being headquartered in Nova Scotia is the stable and consistent balance provided by the current labour legislation." Madam Chair, that is very true, because of course Sobeys has choices. Sobeys does maintain a pretty significant corporate presence in Ontario because they have grown into one of Canada's largest companies, with their grocery business going coast to coast. And they're constantly faced with a very real decision about whether to maintain their corporate head office and all of the jobs that go with it in their home province of Nova Scotia, or to relocate it all at once or slowly over time to a more centrally located province like Ontario. I'm sure many members in the House and many Nova Scotians who have flown through Pearson Airport outside Toronto are very familiar with the Sobeys building just outside the airport in the commercial park there. Sobeys has to decide at the end of the day where they should keep their corporate office functions. And in respect for Sobeys, Madam Chair, we shouldn't just assume that no matter how bad things might get in Nova Scotia under this government, that the fact that they started here will always be enough to keep them here. That's not fair to Sobeys. They are telling us one of the biggest attractions for conducting business here and being headquartered here is, I quote, "the consistent and stable balance provided by the current labour legislation." And yet that's the very balance that the government wishes to upset at this time. Sobeys goes on to say that this legislation is unnecessary and will do serious damage to Nova Scotia's reputation as an excellent place to work and carry on business. These are not my words or the words of an opposition member whose job it is to scrutinize the government's actions. These are the words of Sobeys. Serious damage. There's no wiggle room in that, Madam Chair. Sobeys goes on to say that Bill 102 flies in the face of free bargaining, which is the cornerstone of our economic system. These are the words of Sobeys. Then I could go on with a quoting from this document, Madam Chair, but I think at this point I'll table it in the hopes that one or two government members, perhaps a member from Pictou County, might want to see what Sobeys, headquartered in Pictou County, has to say about first contract arbitration. Because after all, Madam Chair, can Sobeys, which employs 10,000 Nova Scotians, Michelin, which employs another 3,500 Nova Scotians, and all of the 33 chambers of commerce and the associated employers, small and large, that work with them also, could they all be wrong, but only the 31 members on the government side be right? Is that really the view of the NDP, Madam Chair? Needless to say that companies like Sobeys would not have lasted and grown and prospered for 100 years in Nova Scotia and now as a nationwide company if they didn't know a thing or two about making smart investments and creating jobs. So that's why Bill 102 does nothing to protect the economy and in fact puts the economy at risk. But another point, Madam Chair, that I think is worth making is that this is not a matter of whether you're pro-union or anti-union. Every member in this House, I'm sure, and certainly I can speak for the members in the Progressive Conservative Caucus, believes in the collective bargaining process, acknowledges freely the right of any worker or any group of workers to associate collectively and form a union. This is one of the fundamental rights of citizenship, guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, to associate in such a manner. And, Madam Chair, there are hundreds of examples of workers in our province that have done just that, both in the public sector and in the private sector. And similarly, the right of any employer wishing to form a company, wishing to invest their money, wishing to hire their fellow Nova Scotians, has a right to put forward a proposal of wages and benefits and working conditions for workers to consider and hopefully accept, and where there is no agreement to bargain collectively to find that price point of wages and benefits and working conditions that works for both sides. And we have a whole superstructure of legislation to make this happen in an efficient way in our province. The current labor laws allow for the formation of collective unions where union drives happen, where employees can consider the benefits and the costs of unionization, and if they choose, can sign a card, pay their money, have a vote at a future date, and certify. And then approach their employer to bargain collectively, whether it's for a first time or for the 10th time. And Madam Chair, when those two sides in every company in our province are unable to agree, there is a whole superstructure of timelines and rules around conciliation, followed by mediation, followed by multiple voluntary methods of arbitration, whether it's interest arbitration or first contract arbitration, and on it goes. That is why hundreds and hundreds of times over the last 14 years, all of those contracts were collectively negotiated successfully. And in the few occasions where after all of that, after a union certification, after an employer proposal, after a series of bargainings, after an impasse is reached, after a conciliator does his or her work, after a mediator does his or her work, after an arbitrator does his or her work, after all of that, in the 3 instances remaining where an impasse was still present, we have a labor board where if either side feels that they've been dealt with in bad faith, they can appeal to the labor board. And any bad faith provisions in an offer can be removed, and have been, so that good faith bargaining can begin again. And even after all of that, if there is still no agreement, both sides have economic sanctions at their disposal to try and get to an agreement. The union, the right to withhold their labor in the form of a strike. The company, the right to withhold their work in the form of a lockout. These are not happy things. They're meant to be sticks to force the other side to bargain in good faith and to be compelled financially to reach an agreement. In 2010, the most recent year available, it turns out that of all of the contracts concluded in 2010, none, 0, reached that stage of a work stoppage, either a lockout or a strike, because we have all of this process in place to get to a freely negotiated collective agreement by that time. And yet the government still isn't satisfied. It still sees somewhere, hidden under some rock, a problem that it needs to solve with first contract arbitration. And that is a real shame, Madam Chair. And so rather than look to the other side of the House or to all those employers to tell the government why this won't hurt so much in our economy, I think the time has come for government members to stand up and do what they should be doing. The onus should be on them to tell us why, in the face of this overwhelming evidence that there is no problem, that things are working, that only harm can be done at this point, why, in the face of all of that, are they determined to go ahead with first contract arbitration? It is up to the government to make that case, and yet they have not. And yet they remain silent, one after another, on why in their riding, in their constituency, with the employers that they are responsible for, this is a good idea. I would really like to hear that, Madam Chair, because unfortunately for the government, in the absence of a compelling problem, in the absence of any argument about why this should be done, Nova Scotians are forced to come to their own conclusions. And as every day goes by that this bill gets more and more of the light of day shone on it, they're coming to the conclusion that the government has some backroom force that's pushing them to do this. That's what's going on, Madam Chair, that they're putting their backroom party interests ahead of the provincial interest, ahead of jobs, ahead of their constituents. And that's backwards, Madam Chair. That someone is getting payback for having put the government where it is. That someone who doesn't come here and tell us all why they think this is a good idea is pushing the government to do what it's determined to do in the complete absence of any other explanation. Nova Scotians are forced to come to that conclusion because they see overwhelming evidence that this is bad for the province, it's bad for the economy. And that's why Nova Scotians are reminding the NDP, your number one job is to your constituents, to protect the economy, to protect jobs, to ensure that we have the resources available in a growing dynamic economy to create the tax revenue, to pay for the social programs and health care and education and community services that we all want. And not to mess that up, which is exactly where the government is going. And I know, Madam Chair, that the government says, look, this is done in other provinces, 80% or 85, whatever the number is. It changes by the day. That the government says of Canadians that are covered by this legislation, as if that's a good enough argument on its own, Madam Chair. At a time when the economy is as shaky as it is, at a time when the world economy and the North American economy is on shaky ground, no province, no responsible government would decide now is the time to bring in first contract arbitration. And certainly not bring in the most oppressive kind, which is the kind that the NDP here are bringing in today, Madam Chair, where all that has to happen is that there's a 120-day impasse and a contract gets imposed on you. Only 4% of Canadians are faced with that kind of arbitration, Madam Chair, a far cry from the 80% that the government claims. The fact of the matter is, Madam Chair, that a letter sent to the Minister on November 30th explained to the government that the Manitoba model, the model that this bill is crafted after, is in fact the most regressive form of first contract arbitration. And can the government really justify bringing forward the most regressive form at this sensitive time for jobs in our economy? Well, we say no, Madam Chair, it can't. That letter, by the way, to the Minister was signed by a number of important employers and was actually published in the Chronicle Herald. But just for the benefit of the House, I will say, before I table the letter, that it was signed by the Atlantic Building Supply Dealers Association, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, the Canadian Restaurant and Food Services Association, the Construction Association of Nova Scotia, the Halifax Chambers of Commerce, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, the Merit Contractors Association, the Nova Scotia Automobile Dealers Association, the Nova Scotia Chambers of Commerce, the Nova Scotia Home Builders Association, the Restaurant Association of Nova Scotia, the Retail Council of Canada, the Sackville Business Association, the Scotia Group of Companies, the Tourism Association of Nova Scotia, and the Truro and District Chamber of Commerce. All of these groups have come together to tell the government and this minister that this is a bad idea, that they're disappointed that at a time when they are working hard to hold our economy together, to hold on to the jobs that we have, and maybe create a few new ones, that they're disappointed that the government thinks now is a good time to bring forward first contract arbitration. Let's table that letter for the benefit of the House. Madam Chair, in the letter, these businesses are very clear that they believe this is both bad legislation and it's a bad time, and they are very upfront. They consider it to be anti-business, in their words, and they urge the minister to reconsider. Well, Madam Chair, everyone is urging the government to reconsider. Set it aside. Put it aside. Set it aside. Let some more thought go into it. It's the least that could happen at this point. Madam Chair, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business took it upon themselves to do the research that the government has not done and detail the consequences of ramming through this bill without listening to all these concerns. I'll table it in a minute, but just let me tell you, they basically say going forward with Bill 102 underscores the disconnect between the priorities of Nova Scotians and the people in government that purport to represent them. They say it will add uncertainty to an already uncertain economy, that it'll send a message to businesses that the CFIB represents that the government has decided where it wants to go, and the consultation is merely a feel-good exercise. I'll quote from the letter just briefly, Madam Chair, for the benefit of the House. We ask that if the situation were reversed, if non-unionized workplaces were asked to provide advice to the minister on areas that would only impact the workplaces you represent, how would you view that process? That's a very good point, Madam Chair, that in the reverse, if the government were leaving out unionized workplaces, there would be a very legitimate grievance raised by our unions. And yet when they do the same to non-unionized workplaces represented by the CFIB, apparently in the government's view, that is okay. So I'll just give you one more quote from this letter, Madam Chair. We firmly believe that first contract arbitration is contrary to free collective bargaining. Based on what we have heard directly from employers, effective labor relations is built on trusting relationships. Relationships that can only be developed through discussion and negotiation, not with imposed agreements. That, of course, Madam Chair, is only common sense, and so I'll table this letter full of common sense for the benefit of the government. The Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, by the way, represent 5,200 business members in Nova Scotia, a loud voice, a numerous voice that the government ignores at its peril. Madam Chair, the Retail Council of Canada, which together are the second largest source of jobs in our province, told the government in a letter, which I will table in a moment, that, I quote, the negotiation of a first collective agreement is just as important, if not more important, than any renewals. It is important for both employers and unions that all collective bargaining be resolved ultimately at the bargaining table and not through imposition by arbitration. Well, that is a point that employers have been making over and over again. It's a point that up until now, many believed that the NDP agreed with, that it's at the bargaining table, by bargaining in good faith, that healthy, respectful, long-lasting relationships are built, and that contracts that are at their best and are honored and respected are created, not by imposing them. Madam Chair, I'll table that letter from the Retail Council for the benefit of the House. And just reiterate that members on this side of the House, certainly the Progressive Conservative Caucus, which I can speak for, have over and over again expressed our support for the free collective bargaining process, as are the employer groups that have come forward to speak to the government on this important issue. Sobeys has said that Bill 102 flies in the face of free collective bargaining. The Retail Council of Canada also says it flies in the face of the current approach for labour legislation. The Nova Scotia Chambers of Commerce say in all the letters that I tabled that Bill 102 will fly directly in the face of free collective bargaining. Surely the members of the NDP see a theme here. Employers are asking only that we all leave in place the process that is working, the free collective bargaining process that has worked so well for unions and for employers. Madam Speaker, let me just again return to the issue of why are we here debating this bill? Why is the government so determined? They support free collective bargaining. We support free collective bargaining. Employers support free collective bargaining. Unions support free collective bargaining. And yet we have a bill that on a first contract actually rips up the concept of free collective bargaining. That in a province where the average negotiation period is 9.9 months, that it leaves 120 days before the amendments, the tinkering, to reach an agreement, or you get one imposed on you. That's not consistent with free collective bargaining, Madam Chair, and so I love to hear government members argue why, after 120 days plus one extension, that's sufficient recognition of free collective bargaining to then allow for the government to impose a contract. Because of all these concerns, Mr. Chair, I believe the bill should be defeated outright. That it's a bad bill. It's the wrong bill at the wrong time for the wrong reasons, and it ought to be defeated. If the government cannot see fit to do that, then at least they should withdraw it or shelve it or table it or set it aside and leave it there until some compelling case can be made that it's a good bill. But in the absence of that, they should at least shelve it. Now I know, Mr. Chair, that there are some who say, well, it's a bad bill, but let's amend it. Well, in our point of view, Mr. Chair, if it's a bad bill, it's a bad bill, and it deserves to be defeated or shelved. That if you're against it, you're against it. Michelin's against it. In fact, Michelin said in their interview outside Law Amendments that the best thing to do with this bill would be to put it on the shelf. Well, we couldn't agree more. All of the employer groups have come forward and said it's a bad bill. So let's do the right thing at this time, Mr. Chair, and let's kill a bad bill. That's what ought to happen here. This is not one of those times where a little compromise, a little tweaking, an amendment here, an amendment there, will accomplish anything other than make the bill less bad. Well, we're not interested in passing a bill that's less bad either. It's a bad bill at a bad time, and so it ought to be defeated or shelved. And that, I hope, is what will eventually happen. And by the way, I will table Michelin's comments on this matter, Mr. Chair, since I just quoted them. I know in the beginning, 3 weeks ago, when we started to hold up the bill, Mr. Chair, that many Nova Scotians were asking, at a time when the economy is at risk, at a time when jobs are at risk, at a time when we have real work to do with healthcare and education, why are they talking about this thing called first contract arbitration? But they know now, Mr. Chair, they know now why, because it's about jobs. Because it's about jobs, and the Chronicle Herald actually made this very point in their editorial this Sunday. Mr. Chair, and I'll table that editorial, which ties together this awful bill for first contract arbitration with jobs. And I will just hand that over for the benefit of the House at this time. At its heart, Mr. Chair, what the Chronicle Herald in their editorial this Sunday is arguing is that the government seems determined to fix a problem that doesn't exist, while at the same time putting at risk a system that has worked that has created jobs, that has led to collective agreements, that has led to harmonious working relationships in the employers of the province. So that's a great argument that they've made. We don't always agree with them, but we certainly know that the voice of common sense is coming through loud and clear in that editorial. So, Mr. Chair, to drive the point home, I know that the Premier has said there's no jobs crisis in rural Nova Scotia. The government seems to be of the view that there's no problem on jobs, at least outside Halifax. They can debate whether they want to set real targets or not. They have a target on first contract arbitration, but not on jobs. But the numbers from Statistics Canada are very clear. Cape Breton is down 1,300 jobs in the last year. The North Shore, Cumberland, Colchester, Pictou counties, Antigonish, all along the North Shore, down 1,300 jobs. The Valley, the Annapolis Valley, down 2,200 jobs. Southern Nova Scotia is down 1,700 jobs. There is a very real crisis in jobs in rural Nova Scotia, in these parts of Nova Scotia. And in all of those cases, in all of those regions, they deserve a government that focuses on the things that matter to them, like jobs and opportunity, like Michelin in Pictou County and the Valley and Bridgewater, like Polycello in Amherst, like Ropac in Spring Hill, like Oxford Frozen Foods in Oxford, like all of the Sobeys, which virtually every member in this House has a Sobeys, which employs real people, their own constituents, somewhere in the province. These are the things that we should be working at, not bringing forward first contract arbitration and then try and argue it won't make it much worse. We should be spending our time working on bills that'll make it better, that will create jobs, that will get barriers out of the way for those that want to invest their savings and hire Nova Scotians in rural Nova Scotia, and in fact in all of Nova Scotia. Not add more barriers in a province that already is overburdened by the highest taxes in the country, by among the highest power rights in the country, by too much regulation and a government that we can't afford. And now to add to that first contract arbitration, it's too much, Mr. Chair. Those numbers are telling us a very real story, that Nova Scotians are struggling, that businesses that want to stay here and grow are struggling in every region of the province outside Halifax. And for that reason, Mr. Chair, it is so very, very important that the government do the right thing at this point and set aside this bill before any real damage is done. I'm certainly hopeful that for the people of Cumberland County, which I represent along with the NDP member for Cumberland North, that will listen to the very real concerns of Polycello and Ropac and Oxford Frozen Food and others. I know that for Michelin in the Annapolis Valley, where there are 3 NDP members, in Pictou County, where there are 3 NDP members, in the South Shore, in Lunenburg County, where there are at least 2 NDP members. The Michelin is so important to the economic success of those 3 regions of our province that those members on the government side will do the right thing, will put their constituents first, will set aside their partisan interest in the interest of jobs, the jobs that we have now and the jobs that those companies are in a position to create in the future. Because let me be clear, Mr. Chair, as I wrap up, I hate the idea that a future government is going to have to clean up the mess that the NDP are making with bills like Bill 102. But just to be clear, the PC caucus, a future PC government, will clean up this mess. And I hate the idea that we put laws on the books one day and someone else has to take them off the books another day, because that on its own doesn't send a good message about Nova Scotia as a place to invest. But clean up that mess we will if the government proceeds down this awful path with first contract arbitration at this awful time. Wrong bill, wrong time, wrong reasons. So let's do the right thing together now, those members and all our members on this side, and stop this bill before the damage is done. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I now recognize the member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I am pleased to rise in my place today and add my comments with respect to Bill 102. If you look at the title of the bill, Mr. Chair, it's really two-part. It's an act to prevent unnecessary labor disruptions, and also added on to that is to protect the economy. Now, both of those portions of the title are part of the revisions to the Trade Union Act. And when you look at those two different components to the title, it's a little difficult to see the connection because unnecessary labor disruptions may or may not affect the economy. But protecting the economy cannot, in our opinion, and in the opinion of businesses that we've heard, cannot necessarily prevent labor disruptions. So the two parts are quite unrelated, but I do want to speak to both of those parts, Mr. Chair. And I think before we begin to discuss the bill and whether the title is appropriate or whether the bill is needed, it's important that we look at exactly what first contract arbitration is. And we have, as we know, had in this province collective bargaining, which has served employers and employees well. And it has been the mechanism by which they could come to some resolution over their disputes. But if we look at what is first contract arbitration, and it's described as a statutory mechanism that allows either party in those negotiations, if there are unsuccessful negotiations, to apply to a labor board, and that labor board will direct the settlement of a first contract agreement by arbitration. Now, it takes away, and this is what we've heard the members of the government talk about, that it takes away for the worker the threat of a lockout or strike during that first round of collective bargaining. And the first contract, in fact, Mr. Chair, would be arbitrated. And the third party, that being the labor board, would outline the working conditions of that. So it implies in the beginning that things would, be unsuccessful, so we have to do this. However, when we look at what the first contract arbitration looks like, it looks different depending on which model you use. And we have heard about the numbers of provinces in Canada that have some form of first contract arbitration. And we have also heard that the model that is being included in this particular bill is a model that exists in only one of those provinces. But there are 4 types of first contract arbitration. And if I could, Mr. Chair, one of them, the first one here, is automatic, which means that the time limits have been exceeded, but there's no evidence of dysfunction necessary in order to move to that model, or in order to move to that arbitration. There's some fault arbitration, where the minister refers to the labor board. There's some fault by application, which is direct to the labor board, and then there is mediation supported. So if we look at whether in fact, and much of the debate has been whether there is in fact a need for this legislation for first contract, and then we have to look at the different models that are out there and question why the model called the Manitoba model appears to be the one that is being promoted in this piece of arbitration, or this piece of legislation. And currently, we know that in the work environment, in the labor environment, the Labor Board currently does have broad powers, and they can impose collective agreement if it's satisfied that the employer is not bargaining in good faith. And this can happen now through the Labor Board. It can happen as a result of an unfair labor practice complaint. And the Department of Labor currently can provide conciliation and mediation for negotiating parties that have reached that impasse. So currently, with the collective bargaining that we have in the province, with that as a means to come to some agreement, if there is a breakdown, if there's a labor dispute, if there's the belief that an employer is not bargaining in good faith, there's a mechanism in place that we currently have that, and the Department of Labor can work with the parties to bring about some resolution. And what we're hearing from many of the presenters in law amendments, and what we're hearing from many of the people out in our communities, is that this system works. It's something that Nova Scotia should be proud of. It's something that has allowed our labor decisions, our labor agreements, our labor relations to be harmonious. We do not have a lot of walkouts and strikes, and that is because we do have a process that works, and we have opportunities for intervention if things break down. And as I said, that's something that our province is proud of, should be proud of, and that's what the business people are coming in and telling us. They're asking the question that we've asked, what needs to be fixed? We have a good system now. There's no obvious immediate need for regulating parties to negotiate a first contract, and it's really has been described as an unnecessary remedy for that kind of coming together of employer and employee. And as it is now, the parties must respect the duty to bargain in good faith. That's set out in the Trade Union Act, and we have a history of both parties respecting that. And first contract arbitration would facilitate union card signing and organization of unions, and the union would virtually guarantee that employees certain conditions for employment and certain wage structures. And Mr. Chair, this is not, my comments are not anti-union. I have been a member of a union, of the Nova Scotia Teachers Union, during my whole teaching career, and I recognize that the benefits that are realized through the negotiating process, I have benefited from those as a member, as do all members, and all members in this House who are members of the Nova Scotia Teachers Union would also probably be the first to say that they were proud to be a member of that union and that they did benefit from that. But if we lay the groundwork then to what is first contract arbitration, what is it that we currently have in our province? And then that begs the question that we're hearing, so why do we need anything else? Why do we need a change to the Trade Union Act now? Why do we need to impose this kind of legislation on our employers and our employees? And I know when we heard presenters come before law amendments, we were hearing from employers. But we are hearing out in our communities and in our constituencies, we're hearing from employees. So there are both employers and employees who have worked in harmony, who have come to agreements in their workplace, who don't see the need for this particular legislation. And Mr. Chair, when you look at the number of presenters who came before law amendments, you have to wonder, does that not trigger something that, gee, maybe we should go back and take a look at this? If we have high-profile, large employee businesses coming to us and saying, or coming to law amendments and saying, this is how we see this legislation, this is why we don't believe it's good for the employee or the employer, that sends a pretty strong message. And, Mr. Chair, there were a couple of themes that were coming out as you listened to the folks at law amendments. As you listened to the presenters, and I believe there were up to 30 presenters, I don't know the exact number, but there were between 20 and 30 presenters who came and who took time from their busy schedule because they felt passionate enough about this that they wanted to be heard. And we know that every one of those presenters are running businesses and they have a job to do back home, wherever back home is. But they took the time because they wanted to be heard. And they didn't feel that they were being heard without coming before law amendments. And when they left law amendments, I'm not sure that they felt they were heard either. But there were two common themes that we were hearing from those presenters. And one of those was, again, to reflect back to the title of the bill, this bill does nothing to protect the economy. In fact, they went so far as to say the potential is here for this bill to harm the economy and the future growth in our province. When you reflect on the comments that were made by folks like Michelin and Sobeys, I think it's pretty clear where that theme came from, that it does nothing to protect the economy, it has the potential to harm the economy and to the future growth in this province. And by future growth, we'll talk a little bit about some of the examples of how businesses believe that this has the potential to harm future growth in the province. The second theme that we were hearing at law amendments was around the process that was used to develop this legislation. And whenever a piece of legislation is being considered and is being drafted, those people who are supporting the legislation, who are preparing the legislation, who believe there's a need for the legislation, do the wise thing, and that is consult. And that consultation includes the stakeholders that are either directly or indirectly impacted by that piece of legislation. And I'm pleased to see the member from Timberley Prospect, although he's leaving, but perhaps he would come back for one moment. Thank you.
Order. I don't think a member can identify the presence or absence of someone in the House or someone who's leaving the House. Thank you.
I would like to comment on the member from Timberley Prospect who is in the House. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. I will not recognize him, but I will make the comment that during the development of legislation, it's very often that we consult with those people who we believe have something constructive to say, so that the legislation, when it's finalized, is as complete as possible. I will.
Order.
Yes.
Thank you. I just ask whether or not the member for Colchester North would permit an introduction.
I certainly will.
Thank you. The member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville. I recognize.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the member from Colchester North for allowing me to do the introduction. Today we have members of the Masqua Aquatic Club here. I read a resolution earlier today on their great showing at Nationals, and I'd ask that when I read your name, that you do rise and be recognized by the House. We have David Webster, Keelan Earl, Nathan Haley, Adam Scott, Alex Scott, Katie Kells, Sean Gibson, Pam Day, and Jordan Coyle. I do ask that the House give you a warm round of applause and congratulations on everything you've done.
Thank you. We welcome all our visitors, especially the successful ones. All of them, everyone, and the students as well, especially the students. And I also want to thank the member for Colchester North for ceding the floor, and you have the floor again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and we always have time for students. I will continue where I was going. I was talking about the process, which was one of the themes that came out at the law amendments as presenters believed that the process had been flawed. And I was saying, Mr. Chair, that when you're looking at putting together a piece of legislation, the consultation with the stakeholders, with the people who are have the potential to be impacted both directly and indirectly, are people you want to consult with, so that you know that when the final document is presented, that you have exhausted as much as possible every possible source of information and put together something that is as close to perfect as possible. None of us ever get that legislation perfect, but we try. And I was going to suggest that there were a couple of members in the House who did work very closely on some educational legislation a few years ago. And I believe, and they would be the first, I think, to tell you that they believe that the legislation that was presented was stronger because of the input that they had, and that together we had to put together something that that was in the best interest of students. So when we look at that theme that came out of the Law Amendments Committee, the second theme that I was talking about was the process of developing that legislation appeared, according to the presenters, to be flawed. And some of the things that they cited that would cause them to believe the process could have been better. And that was that they were suggesting that no non-union representation on the Labour Management Review Committee was not a good thing. The second thing is that the study day, in their opinion, was hastily organized and did not look at whether or not this first contract arbitration would be beneficial to the stakeholders. They believed that the outcome of the process on that particular day, on that study day, only looked at models of FCA and measured the models one against the other. So they're suggesting that when they went into that study day, that the decision had already been made that there would be first contract arbitration. It wasn't a study day to decide if there should be. It was to decide. They believe that that decision was made before they ever went into that day. And therefore, you know, what input do you have? It's not unlike some other decisions where a decision has been made and then you're asked, which of the three medicines do you want to take? Well, maybe you didn't want to take any. But it appears to the presenters and to those businesses who came before us that the decision had been made before the study day. And the study day was just to look at the different models and try to decide which model would be the one that was included in this particular bill. So that was a theme, that part of the theme. Then we had the theme got played out a little more elaborately when we had people like Sobeys, and we've heard about Sobeys. We know how big Sobeys is. We know the positive impact that it has had on Nova Scotia. We know that in many of our communities, most of us as MLAs have at least one Sobeys. And we know that it's our local men and women in our communities who are employed at Sobeys. So it is a company that deserves a lot of respect. They have done a lot to help build and boost and maintain the economy of our province. But they were saying that they were not invited to this study day. So if you're looking at trying to see what impact legislation might have on employers and employees, it seems pretty obvious that the first person or the first company you would look to would be one of the largest employers in the province. Sobeys were telling us, we were not invited to attend. So that tells you right away that they obviously would feel, I guess our opinion is not valued. I guess our input is not being sought. Why were we not included? Why were we not invited? And you know, I know when you organize something like that, we have so many businesses, large and small, in this province that they could not all be at that table. And you have to look at a representation when you make those decisions as to who is going to be there. But to exclude the largest employer in the province certainly sent a message, and people were not impressed with that message. Another theme that came out during the law amendments was that the LMRC did not reach a consensus, and yet first contract arbitration legislation is being introduced. So again, they're questioning the process. It wasn't to decide if first contract was good or not. The largest employer in the province was not included. There was no consensus as to reached before the decision was made. And so again, it goes back. What decisions were made? What was the real intent of that organization, or that study day? And if it wasn't to discuss the need, if it wasn't to hear from the largest employer, and if it wasn't based on consensus, then what was the purpose of having that study day? Then, in the midst of all of the and so these are concerns that were common themes when they presented. And then in the midst of all of the law amendments presentations, of course, the directive went out regarding the schedule. And some presenters had to either rush in or be told, we can't hear from you. If you're not here on this particular day, tough, too bad. And that, Mr. Chair, is really a slap in the face of the whole process for which the law amendments stands. And the Law Amendments Committee is to provide the public, the people of the province, to provide an avenue for them to be heard. And when they're treated like that, it doesn't sound like it's a very open process, again, where there's any interest in, on the part of the government, of hearing what they might have to say at the law amendments. And so when you start down a process and you have those kinds of flaws that are identified by the public, it doesn't do a lot to build support for the legislation that you're hoping to pass. And out of all of that, it begs the question, what decisions were made before the study day? Why did they even have the study day? If the study day was not to do what it was portrayed to do, then why have it? So we have, Mr. Chair, two common themes that came out, again, that I will repeat. One was the fact that there's nothing in this act to protect the economy. And the second one is that the process was flawed. Now, Mr. Chair, those are not my thoughts. Those are the comments from the people, Nova Scotians, from one end of this province to the other, who deserve to have a voice, who see this as their house, the people's house, where they can come and have their voice, and to be ignored, to be stifled, to be treated in a way that they felt lacked respect is not the way you build support. It's not the way you open the House up for Nova Scotians. And you know, these weren't, I spoke about Sobeys, but these weren't, Sobeys wasn't the only large company. And when you look at some of the presenters, and you look at the businesses and the employees, the numbers of employees that they represent, Mr. Chair, the numbers are fairly significant, and they are worthy of attention, I would think, by any government. For example, there was a presentation done and representation from the food service industry as an example. And that food service industry represents about 1,600 businesses in the province, and approximately 30,000 jobs in those 1,600 businesses. And some of those, Mr. Chair, are pretty small businesses. We have them in our own constituency. And those businesses need a voice. And they were represented here, not individually, but collectively. Those businesses were represented here. 30,000 jobs that are a result of those 1,600 businesses in the food industry. Then there was the tourism industry. And the tourism industry, now some of those would be your food service industry, but there are about 4,000 businesses that fall under that category of tourism. And again, between 30 and 40,000 jobs. Some of those are seasonal, but they are employment for Nova Scotians, and those Nova Scotians who are employed put money into our economy. The Construction Association was represented, and that's an industry, 800 members in that industry, and about 27,000 jobs in the construction industry, or Construction Association. We're starting to add up here, 30,000, 40,000, 27,000. Building supply dealers, 200 plus businesses were represented as building supply dealers, and that they have between 4,000 and 5,000 jobs. 4,000 or 5,000 more people who are making a contribution to the economy of this province. Merit contractors, 130 members. CFIB, 5,000 businesses. No calculation of the number of employees. Call centers, 45 businesses, and again, when you know how call centers operate, one business employs a lot of people, one call center. Out of those 45 business call centers in Nova Scotia, looking at 13,000 employees. The Nova Scotia Chambers of Commerce. Now, the Nova Scotia Chambers of Commerce was there, and they did a presentation on behalf of their members. And there are 33 chambers that are part of the Nova Scotia Chambers of Commerce. And again, some of those businesses that are represented by a chamber are small businesses. Maybe they only employ 4 or 5 people, but they have an organization, and they have an association, and they have an avenue where they can hopefully have a voice. And so through them, we heard that they are not happy with the impact that this legislation can have on their small business. Halifax Chamber, 90,000 employees represented by the Halifax Chamber, 1,600 businesses. That is huge. That is huge. So if you have 90,000 employees who may not see the benefit or who do not see the benefit of this legislation, then what kind of a message are we sending? And to the 1,600 businesses, again, some of them small, are we telling them that we value what they are able to do for the economy of our province? Are we telling them that we want to work with them so that they will continue to stay in business, that they will continue to provide employment for our people? The Retail Council, 5,000 businesses, 30,000 employees. The Road Builders Association, and together, the Road Builders Association are telling us that they have about 7,500 employees. These are the people that we live beside, that we work with, that we shop with, our kids go to school with. These are the people who go to the Sobeys and take the money that they earned at their job and put it into Sobeys. These are the people who are helping to build the economy and hold the economy at a difficult time. And so I could go on with that list, but I think the point is, Mr. Chair, that from those 13 business organizations that were represented by one presenter, they cover a huge number of businesses, both large and small, from one end of the province to the other, and they create hundreds, thousands of jobs. And every one of them wanted their voice to be heard through the presenter at law amendments. So when we go to what did we hear at law amendments, we heard those two themes, and that this will not be good for the economy and that the process was flawed. Now, if I could, Mr. Chair, I would like to speak a little bit about some of the comments from some of the large employers who did take the time to come and speak, and in no particular order. But I think it's important that we recognize that when you have the president of Michelin Canada coming to law amendments in Halifax, when they have a huge responsibility well beyond Halifax and well beyond Nova Scotia, but they recognize that this is pretty important. And Michelin employs 3,500 people in this province, and it's been here since the early 70s. And there are many people who have spent their whole career working at Michelin. There are MLAs in this House who have people in their communities who are into second generation working at Michelin. Michelin has provided great employment opportunities, and they have paid good wages. And I can tell you that when I look across the mountain at Pictou County, I recognize the wealth of Pictou County may have been influenced by the fact that Michelin has been a great employer in that particular county. People from Colchester drive over to Michelin to work. It has been a great place. And the president, who has been very much responsible for harmonious working relationships between the employer and the employee, felt strong enough to come here and speak about their plants at Bridgewater, Granton, and Waterville. And I heard him speak, and I was alarmed when I heard him say that they have 18 plants. They only have 3 in Canada, and guess what? They are all here in Nova Scotia. That's something to be very proud of. Obviously, they could put their Michelin plants wherever they wanted. And in fact, they have, I think, 14 in the U.S. For little old Nova Scotia to have attracted that company and that they would see fit to establish 3 plants here, and they've been going since the 70s, is something of which we should be proud and we should not let slip away from us. And when that president was talking about what this particular bill could do for the...
Order. It is getting a little noisy in the House, if you don't mind just keeping it down back there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When you consider the decisions that that president has to make. They've already made a decision to have 14 plants in the U.S. They've made a decision to have 3 in Canada, and they're here in Nova Scotia. We better look after those business partnerships that we have with the Michelins, because they could easily pack up overnight and be gone. And when the president is saying to the law amendments, the decisions that we make about future investment in this province, one of the factors that we will have to consider is this piece of legislation. They don't have to stay here, and they may not stay here. And when those MLAs who have Michelin plants in their communities, or have workers who travel to Michelin plants, if those were not there, what good-paying, solid, stable kinds of employment opportunities would come in to replace them? We don't even want to think about that, because we know how devastating that would be to Bridgewater, Granton, Waterville, and all of the communities around. So it was quite alarming to hear the president from Michelin make that statement. They consider regions for investment based on factors including, and these are his words, including stable labor relations. Obviously, since the 70s, they have found that working labor relations in this province were stable, or they would not still be here, because they don't have to stay. So if we don't pay attention to that, they went on to say that the bill increases uncertainty and may make Nova Scotia less attractive for future investment. Now, those are pretty strong words. And I know that that members on the Law Amendments Committee heard those words and may have been as surprised as the rest of us. They were thought-provoking. We have to stop and pay attention to that. And employers need to be able to say no to what they cannot afford. Everyone is looking at the profit margin, and every businessman knows that when costs go up and production does not, that their profit margin gets smaller. And if this particular legislation has the potential to impact on that cost for that employer, then that employer has no obligation to stay here in Nova Scotia. They saw this as a union organizing tool, and we heard the president speak about attempts to unionize. And you know, when an employer and the employees can come to an agreement without being forced into that agreement, the pride that those workers have in their company and the respect that they get from their employers is what makes a success. And when you have that combination, then we would be wise to leave it alone. Now, those are the you know, some of the comments from Michelin, and the president went on to say that Michelin's position was very clear. If we were unionized and after bargaining in good faith, we were unable to reach a satisfactory contract, his words were, "We don't want any third party who knows nothing about our business coming in to tell us what the terms and conditions will be." So if the employer and the employees who both know the business can't come to some agreement, this president doesn't want somebody who knows nothing about the business coming in and imposing some terms and conditions. And he said, and if in fact that happened, as a company, they would have very few options. And he concluded by saying, "Let me be clear. This bill and the increasing uncertainty do not help Michelin present Nova Scotia as a better place to invest." This president has to look at where he can invest, where he can have his plants, manufacturing plants, where he can have them, where they're a good working relationship, where they have a well-skilled workforce, and where they can make a profit. There's no question they need to make a profit. But this bill will definitely have a negative impact on future investment by Michelin in the province of Nova Scotia if it is passed. So a pretty strong message there, Mr. Chair, from one of the biggest and most successful employers in the province, and one of the employers, as I said earlier, that has contributed to a working environment and to the building of the economy, not just in the communities where the plant is situated, but in communities all around the province where people travel to work. It has contributed significantly. A lot of jobs, stable work, and good paying jobs. So, first message, did the government listen? Did the government recognize that maybe we need to go back and rethink this? Maybe we need to, maybe we should have heard from Michelin and Sobeys and those people when we were having our study day or when we were consulting. Maybe we should have heard what these folks had to say. Hearing it before you get to law amendments may have allowed a better piece of legislation. And that goes back to my earlier comment that if you want the legislation to be well received, to be effective, and to be the strongest legislation that you can have, then you need to make sure that your scope of consultation is broad and that you consult with the people who will be impacted by the decision that's made. So, in hindsight, maybe it would have been better for government to listen to the Michelins and the Sobeys of the world to see how they felt about it. And as I said, maybe the legislation would have looked differently. Maybe there wouldn't be any legislation, but maybe it would have looked differently. Maybe it would have reflected what they were identifying as their issues and their concerns. Another group that came before the Law Amendments Committee was the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. And they represent 5,200 small, independent local businesses. And I talked earlier about small businesses needing to have a voice. Some of these businesses have 8, 10, or fewer employees. And they need a mechanism to come together and to be heard. And through the Federation, they have that mechanism. And the presenter on their behalf made the statement, "I don't know of anyone who was talking about first contract arbitration before Bill 102. So it sounds like there was not a lot of anxiety and not a lot of talk, not a lot of, gee, we have some problems here in our workforce. We need to look at some legislation that will help resolve that. They weren't hearing anything about that. And, you know, I have to tell you, as an MLA, I didn't hear anything about it. I have not heard anything about labor unrest, the need for arbitration, for first contract arbitration. And so I don't know how many MLAs were hearing it, but I've not heard one say to me, well, you know, that was a real issue in my constituency. Not heard that. And the Canadian Federation of Independent Business are saying they didn't hear it. So it goes back to my earlier comment, why the legislation? Who wanted it? The large businesses like Michelin and Sobeys didn't. The small businesses represented by the CFIB didn't want it. So the question is, who did? And again, on behalf of all of these small businesses, the presenter said that we have good labor relations in this province. We have no need for FCA. And what businesses do want is investment so they can continue as a small business to survive and hopefully thrive. And that is where they would like the government to be focusing their attention. So how increasingly difficult it is, they're saying, to keep the doors open of small, independent, and local business. And a couple of small businesses, we know that there were some in the town of Truro. Margolian's, a business that's been there for years, was forced to close. We know that the Kavanaugh's food market, been there for years, was forced to close. We know that some small mechanic car shop garages were forced to close. And so that's not what small business don't want legislation. Small business wants support so they can continue. And so the small businesses are concerned about this legislation, but they're also concerned about the increased costs that they're having to bear, which are causing them to not be able to meet the bottom line. And when that happens, Mr. Chair, you know what it does. Those people are laid off. Those people are unemployed. Those people have no money to put back into the economy. And if they're not able to get employment, Mr. Chair, then they will become, we will be providing for them through some of our social programs. And none of them want to be on those social programs. They want to work. But if they don't have those opportunities with small businesses, then they will not be able to work. The third presenter that I want to speak about is Sobeys. And of course, Sobeys, we've said, employs about 10,000 people in the province of Nova Scotia. And the fact that they were not invited was shameful. It was really a slap in their face. But they came to law amendments because they felt passionate enough about their message that they wanted to be heard. And so they were. And again, talking about possible future expansion or future investment. And they're Atlantic. So they're not tied to Nova Scotia. Michelin is not tied to Nova Scotia. Michelin can go anywhere in North America, and they have. Sobeys are not tied to Nova Scotia. They can go to other provinces in Atlantic Canada, and they have. And they have enjoyed a balanced labor management environment in Nova Scotia for a long time. And one of the biggest attractions, Sobeys presenters said, one of the biggest attractions for Sobeys conducting business and being headquartered in Nova Scotia is the stable and consistent balance provided by current labor legislation. So they're happy, their employees are happy, they're not asking for anything more. In fact, they state that they believe that Bill 102 will do serious damage to Nova Scotia's reputation as an excellent place to work and carry on business. So not only are we hearing from businesses here who are not in support of this bill and who recognize the negative impact it can have on our economy. We're hearing from those who are here, Mr. Chair, but we're not hearing from the others who may be looking to come here. And if looking to come here, one of the first things they look at is the labor relations and the labor environment. And they hear that, yes, it's a stable environment, it's a great working environment, employee have good working relationships. But then all of a sudden they hear, yes, but they now have first contract arbitration. How many of them are going to stop in Moncton instead of coming to Nova Scotia? You know, we know we're in competition. We know that Nova Scotia is in competition with New Brunswick. And we know that this model of first contract arbitration does not exist in New Brunswick. So they don't have to cross the border. They can stay there. So we have two challenges. We have the challenge of keeping the businesses, both large and small, that we have in Nova Scotia. And then we have the challenge of attracting new ones. We've heard the unemployment numbers. We know how many people in Nova Scotia are looking for work. But if we don't have businesses coming here to provide job opportunities for them, that number is going to either increase or they'll be gone. So making Nova Scotia a warm and welcoming place for businesses to come and establish is something that we all want. And I would expect, Mr. Chair, that there's not one MLA in this House who wouldn't welcome a successful business into their community or into their constituency, because they know the boost that is to their economy. They know the job opportunities that provides. And so we can't ignore that. We can't drive people away. We have to keep what we have, and we have to attract more. Sobeys goes on to say that changes to the Trade Union Act should only be made where there is a consensus between Labour and management that there is a real problem to address. And you know, Mr. Chair, that question has been asked many times since Bill 102 was introduced. The question that was asked was, what is the rationale for this legislation? And the question was asked, what problem is this intended to fix? And neither of those questions have been answered. They were not answered for the folks who came. They were not answered, obviously, for Sobeys, because they're asking the question. There is a real problem. If there's a real problem to address, and only then should there be any kind of joint consultation with Labour and management. And as I said in some of my earlier comments, there is a mechanism in place in this province now to resolve that. It has worked well, and people like Sobeys are saying, let's keep what we have. It's working well. There's no problem that's been identified, and if there is a problem, they're asking and they're not getting any answer. So Sobeys asked for some changes. Not unlike what our caucus did, recognizing that we have been told that this legislation will be rammed through. This legislation will be pushed through. And in a majority government, the government can do that. Everybody recognizes that. So what Sobeys were saying and what our caucus was saying, well, if it has to be, then will the government look at some amendments that may address some of the concerns that have been raised? And so Sobeys was suggesting, they were asking for things like the change that would require a party to demonstrate that the other party had been bargaining in bad faith. So if that was included, then Sobeys would find it more palatable. They wouldn't like it, but they would find it more palatable. They also said they would like a change that would give the Labour Board more authority to require further collective bargaining with a rigid timeline, mediation, and the authority to permit that a strike or lockout continue rather than requiring an immediate end when an application for first contract is made. They gave this enough thought, even though they weren't invited to the day and even though they weren't consulted. They read through the legislation, they read through the amendments, And they determined, well, maybe if it looked like this, or maybe if we added something else, maybe if the government would consider. And so they took enough time to make up some of their own amendments to present for consideration. And you know, I think that's a gesture on the part of Sobeys that is worthy of acknowledgement. Because having been excluded, having looked at this and said there's no need of it, but let's look at working with the government to see if we can come up with something, again, that improves the legislation. And so they presented those. And what did the government do with them? I don't see them as part of the amendments that the government's putting forward. So again, is there consideration for what those presenters are coming forward with? And you know, we talk about our own constituencies, and you know, Colchester North is a pretty rural part of the province, and the economy of rural Nova Scotia is suffering. The days of having a lot of the primary industries in rural Nova Scotia support our population are gone. We don't have many communities that are supported now by farming, fishing, lumbering, mining, and small manufacturing. Those are gone. And we have seen many communities across our province who have, they're dead. The main industry is gone. And what happens, Mr. Chair, when communities get in that situation, those people want to work, and they will go where they can find work. But the numbers of centers where these people can go to get employment so that they can make money and contribute to the economy, those numbers are getting more centralized. And for Colchester North, if you want employment, you have to go to Debert or Truro or Pictou or Halifax or Moncton. Every one of those places that people have to go for employment require an additional cost because they have to drive. There are many people, and I'm just using Colchester North as an example, but there are other rural constituencies as well. And it costs. But those people, by driving, are putting money back into the economy. They're driving to their employment, they're earning a fair wage, and they're driving back home. But the more restrictions we put on and the more we force some of our small businesses to fold because they can't survive, the more harm we're doing to the economy, because the only money that people have to put in to the economy is the money they earn. And if they don't have a job to go to earn that money, then they will not be contributors, and they will be taking away from the coffers of the province rather than contributing to the coffers of the province. And so, Mr. Chair, we have to make sure that the efforts of the government are to invest and keep the small businesses surviving and thriving, that we keep the large businesses here because they put millions of dollars into the economy, and that we have to create an environment that is inviting. And so when we look at what the potential that this bill has to harm the economy, it's alarming and it's disturbing. We have to protect the economy. We don't have we don't have a strong economy in Nova Scotia, and our mandate as members in this legislature government or opposition, is to make sure that whatever we do, whatever legislation we pass, is geared at protecting what we have, retaining what we have, and, Mr. Chair, making it an inviting place for others to come and do business. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to rise this evening to speak to the title of Bill 102, an act to prevent unnecessary labour disruptions and protect the economy. Under less severe circumstances, the title of the bill would be laughable. Mr. Chair, when Sobeys wasn't invited to their study day, when non-union representatives were underrepresented on their study day, when our own member wasn't allowed into the study day because they said there was no lunch. Mr. Speaker, that's laughable. Not to invite stakeholders and not to allow opposition members into a study day to discuss a bill that's of such importance to the province is the laughable part. The NDP have yet to come forward and explain how this bill is going to protect our economy. In fact, stakeholder after stakeholder, representing thousands of employees, have come forward, all saying the same thing. This bill will not, under any circumstance, protect the economy. Job creator after job creator tells us it will only hinder it. Over the past few weeks, we've heard from many employers in Nova Scotia. They came to the city at their own expense to voice their concern about Bill 102. Mr. Chair, we have a boundary review committee going on right now that took their show on the road, 5 different areas in the province. And we couldn't give the same consideration to a bill that's going to affect the whole province. We had 1 day. And then we had to have these employers come to the city to present their case on Bill 102. But they did, Mr. Chair. They came to the city in droves, speaker after speaker, stakeholder after stakeholder, to voice their problems with Bill 102, their concern over this bill. We've had owners and representatives of some of the largest companies operating in this province, which make up a huge portion of the jobs that employ Nova Scotian workers. And they've all expressed unanimous disapproval for first contract imposition and Bill 102. Through this bill, the NDP have proven one thing: their priorities are not Nova Scotia's priorities. We know it isn't a priority for the NDP to consult with the people that will actually be affected by decisions they're making. They showed us that with Bill 100, and they've confirmed it here with Bill 102. And we know that the NDP have some big favours to pay back to their special interest friends. Is that why this bill is being introduced? But despite all of this, in the time I have to speak here today, I will try once again to convey the message that our party, major employers in Nova Scotia, and the associations and groups that represent tens of thousands of Nova Scotia workers have been trying to convey for the last month. And that is the damaging effects the first contract imposition could have on this province. And I will urge the members of the NDP caucus to reconsider their decision. There is still time. There is still time to do what's right for Nova Scotia job creators and Nova Scotia workers and stop this bad legislation. And there's still some time to prove that NDP MLAs who were sent to this House of Assembly by their constituents are listening to most important voices of all, the people of Nova Scotia, the people who put them here. It's funny, Madam Chair, that we've been hearing about this bad legislation from our constituents, but no one on the other side is hearing anything bad.
I think everything's fine.
Have they discussed this with some of the major employers in their area? I seem to think not, if they're not hearing the same thing we're hearing. But of course, we're in rural Nova Scotia as well. There is still time for all of them to do the right thing. Still time for the member from Pictou East to stand up and do the right thing for job creators and workers in his constituency. I know for a fact he heard the presentation at the Law Amendments Committee. He was there for Janet Hawley's presentation. He heard what we heard. Mrs. Hawley spoke at length to the Law Amendments Committee last week about the important role that contact centres play in employing over 13,000 Nova Scotians. Now, maybe this doesn't mean much to the member from Pictou East, but I'm sure he has many constituents who work for Convergys in New Glasgow. Convergys, a major employer for Pictou County. But as we saw last year with the closure of Convergys' operation in Cornwall, contact centre operations are susceptible to economic downturn, as any other business in this province. If contact centres are at risk of closing in the current economic environment, what chances will they have on their first contract imposition? Mrs. Hawley made it perfectly clear in her presentation. Contact centres can employ workers in countries like Jamaica for as little as $3 an hour. She went on to say that currently the superior skills and quality of labour in Nova Scotia makes it worth the extra cost to operate in this province. However, with rising taxes, raising wage costs, and potentially with the implementation of this first contract imposition, those costs could rise even higher and further negate the benefit of the skilled labour that our province has to offer. As we saw happen just last year in Cornwallis, Nova Scotia contact centres are already performing a fine balancing act to justify these extra costs. And even in the current climate, they cannot always manage to stay open. How many extra costs can this government add to the cost of doing business before all the contact centres in Nova Scotia give in to this temptation to move their operations? How much more damage does the NDP government have to do before these temptations turn into survival necessities for Nova Scotia businesses? That's a good question for the Minister of Justice, a member for Pictou Centre. He's a cabinet minister. He should have been able to go back to the cabinet table and tell his colleagues that this will be bad for this constituency, for all of Pictou County. But now, unless he stands up here and does the right thing, he's going to have to explain this to his constituencies. Why all their jobs have been shifted to Jamaica or to Asia once the first contract is imposed, and Convergys no longer feel safe investing in the region. And when he has to go back to his constituents 6 months, maybe a year after first contract imposition is in place, and explain to his constituents when Convergys starts discussions about pulling another operation out of Nova Scotia that he didn't see this coming, how are they supposed to believe him then? When the organizations that represent Convergys themselves and all other contract centres in this province stood in front of the NDP government and said it was wrong. I have news for the Minister of Justice, for all the Pictou County MLAs. I haven't been here for long, but I know a thing or two about serving the people. And I can tell you this, it doesn't matter what side of the House I'm on. If there's an initiative that I know that will kill jobs in Cape Breton North, I won't be voting for it. I won't be voting for to drive jobs away from my constituency. Unfortunately, I'm a member of a caucus that supports job creation and economic growth. And the member for Pictou East, the Minister of Justice, and the Minister of Natural Resources were not